Hello and welcome to In the Making, a series of conversations from North Bennett Street School where we connect with a range of new voices, fields, and perspectives. Before we get into our conversation, we want to thank the many supporters that make our programs possible, including the Massachusetts Cultural Council and our partners in Craft. Thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Kristen Odell. I am an NBSS staff member and host of In the Making. For our last program of the season, thank you all for being here throughout the season. We're so grateful to have Cannupa Hanska Luger here with us. Thank you so much. Cannupa is a New Mexico-based artist who uses social collaboration in response to timely and site-specific issues. You were raised on Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota, and have built your life around connecting performance and political action to tell stories about 21st century Indigenous life through massive installations that have included ceramics, video, sound, fiber, steel, tech, and repurposed materials. Your work invites the world to engage with Indigenous peoples and values and often presents a call to protect endangered lands. Welcome, Cannupa. Thank you for being here.
Docha Maragua, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy to join your community and your group. From here where I live, this is my studio. So it is, I'm in the midst of producing a lot of things right now, which I'm happy to and excited to share with you and your community. But I am coming from a small town called Glorieta, New Mexico. And this is the kind of traditional homelands of the Tewa and Towa people. There is a pueblo just across the interstate from where I live that is no longer inhabited. And that was a Tewa pueblo called Pecos, and now there is a town there called Pecos.
Thank you. And you also mentioned that there's a fire 10 miles away from your home, which
yeah, maybe it's a little bit more than 10. It feels closer than 10. I can see the flames at night. We can see the smoke during the day. It's, yeah. So far, so good.
Okay, good. I just want to, I'm going to just throw something into the universe at you and let's start there. I've heard you say that being viewed as other at one point was the avenue by which you became an artist. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think the kind of like most generous mental health effort of being experienced as other is that you exist kind of on the periphery of a larger kind of social structure. That view from the periphery, you kind of have to be on the edge and in order to be able to see the whole thing for what it is, rather than when you're in it, it's hard to see it because you're so close to everything. I was fortunate enough, my mother is also an artist. Her name is Kathy Whitman Elkwam, and she's a stone sculptor, she's a painter, she works in jewelry. So I had the opportunity to see art as a way of living from an early age. And it's funny because that probably deterred me more from becoming an artist than it did, consider.
In what way? In what way?
It's hard. This
existence, yes.
Yeah.
The career of art, yeah.
It's not, there's no guarantee, there's no check at the end of the day that you can kind of easily rely on. And so it was feast and famine, growing up. And it's the industry of art and art making is a fickle industry, so you get to kind of like see that firsthand. I am, I'm one of 5 siblings who was raised by my mom. And she raised us as a single parent on an art career. So of course it was feast and famine for us, but at the same time, as I got older, I was like, that's an amazing feat, to clothe us and feed us, provide shelter, all of that, while participating in a career. And it was exhausting. She worked a lot in order to make that happen. But I come from both sides of my family are kind of like working folk. So my mom's an artist, and there's, you know, incredible labor in that. And my dad's a cattle rancher. So between the two, you kind of grow accustomed and acclimated to the privilege of hard labor, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. So you knew that you could, at one point, you knew that, okay, I know that I can do this because I have the work ethic for one thing, and you can, you know, you're going to make this a career.
And I would also bolster that with the fact that I seen it work, you know, and that's one of the big challenges. Like, there was a moment in my life where I had to decide to commit, you know, where I was doing, you know, as an artist, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners and maybe yourself, you know, understand this. When you're building a career around art, you're not like killing it right off the bat. You're still learning, you're still developing your voice, you're still developing the conversation, and you're still learning. So you have to practice and you have to make. Simultaneously, you got to pay rent, you got to feed yourself, you got to feed, you know, your family or people around you. So you do other jobs. And so, you know, I was doing other jobs, working in, you know, everything, hotels, barbershops, you know, coffee shops, you know, just every other kind of job.
That's just a rite of passage as an artist. I mean, you have to do that.
Totally. But what I found was no one was going to take me seriously until I did. And in order to take myself seriously, I had to not distract myself with all of the other things, buy an enormous bag of dried beans and commit to creating as a way. Because in that, I don't know, and I don't want to get like metaphysical and hokey, but I am a part of the universe, you know, like I am a part of the universe, and the universe does not want to fail. Like it doesn't, you know.
Wait, clarify something for me. Were the bag of dried beans to eat or to make art with? What?
What's the difference?
It's
what
true.
is the difference? No, so I ended up I committed to art as a way. And then I had the opportunity to go to school for my undergrad here in New Mexico, where I still currently live, at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And my last semester at that school, I had been in the world and I had been working, and I was like, all right, now I'm in a school, and I'm trying out everything. Like I came in as a painter, and that's where I got my first kind of introduction to ceramics and working with clay. And there was my last semester of school, I literally took my funding that I had. I was fortunate enough to write for and receive an NEA grant. So I had a little bit of money. And with that money, I started to think, all right, what does this school provide for me that I do not have once I leave this school? And so I bought a huge bag of beans for my last semester, this kiln that's right here in my studio still to this day, a nice camera, and a laptop computer. And that pretty much ate up my grant, you know, as far as what I had to go to school. Paid for the schooling, obviously, and then got all of these things. So all of my living expenses were transformed into things that I knew I would need afterwards. And between this kiln and that camera, those were probably the two things that made the most, the kind of like greatest impact once I left the school.
They're so on the end of different spectrums, though. Very analog, very technical. I mean,
yeah,
did
totally.
you know at that moment that you were going to be so multi-processed, or what?
No, in fact, the camera was only to photograph the things that I made out of clay. Like, we did have a photography program at IAIA, and I didn't take any of those courses, but what I would do is use my work that I was producing in one class and talk to my peers who were photography students and be like, can you photograph this well for me? And the power of a good photograph at the time that I came into the world was profound. A good photograph gets kind of like position in print, which was, it's interesting. I had to like think about, art making as a craft, but also as a lifestyle. You have to take into consideration the economics of the industry that you're kind of participating in. And I found that a mediocre piece of work with a really good photograph would trump an incredible piece of work with a mediocre photograph every time in print, which is nuts. But that was the digital world in which I came into.
Yeah. For our guests with us, we will see some work. We're not going to do any slideshow presentation because you can see the full body of Cannupa's work on his website. So Cannupa in a bit will take us through his studio to actually see some material that he's working with. But I also want to comment, if there are Boston locals here, I'm assuming or hoping that you saw his joint show with Marie Watt at Peabody Essex recently, and saw the big she-wolf that work is titled Each Other, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that Each Other exhibition was, I think it might be an interesting place to kind of like dive in here for deeper conversation and transition into some of my own work, because that exhibition Each Other was, it was dreamed up by John Lukovic at the Denver Art Museum. And he and his institution was interested in what a lot of institutions were interested in at the time. And this is just before the COVID pandemic. There was social collaborative work was like in vogue, museums.
Wait, just pre-pandemic? Just pre-pandemic or yeah?
Well, it was, pre-pandemic. I think it's still kind of in that position, but this is a very old way of creating. I'm imagining, there at North Bennett, there is a long tradition of master and apprentice and teaching and educating through cooperation, right? Like group, like that. How is that not social engagement? But it was defined in a way that was consumable by larger museum institutions, especially when they're like in a position of asking, what is their relationship to their community? What is the museum's relationship to its immediate community? Social collaboration as a art practice, opened up the opportunity for artists to bridge that conversation for institutions, and like really invite their public in to create work together, to understand what it means to be, in those positions. But the Each Other exhibition, all of the work that was selected between Marie Watt and I were all works that we had created in collaboration. So it is a bit of a retrospective of each of our practices, but it was narrowed and focused into works that we built in collaboration with not just other people, but environment, more than human kinships, like what community is like bigger than the Anthropocene or the human experience or the institutional experience, Right. So the she-wolf, that was the only piece that we had ever actually collaborated on together. So we were building this whole exhibition, and simultaneously, we had to come up with a way for us to collaborate as an expression, and that she-wolf became the kind of like core of our collaboration and our opportunity to have a much larger kind of intersection with whichever communities are around the museum and in relationship to art and culture at large.
So the band, I had a real sensation seeing it with the use of bandanas, because I grew up as a baby with like a worn pink band. My mom would put a pink bandana around my head, and so why was that the object? Why was that the relic used?
Yeah, well, that was in response to change. And I think artists are really good at adapting to change, whereas institutions are much slower to do so. They're brick and mortar. It's hard to turn that ship, But artists can respond to our environment quite quickly. And that she-wolf was going to be an entirely different piece when we first started having this conversation, because it was before a pandemic. And we were going to invite people in to actually build the piece as it traveled from museum to museum, which
Oh,
would
just
mean,
adding to it, you mean?
yeah, and we were going to use completely different material. The structure was going to be completely different. But then we had a pandemic, you know, in the middle of us doing all of our planning, right before we started to build. We had all of our pieces selected for what was going to go into the exhibition. And then Marie and I were both like figuring out how we were going to create something together. That piece, we chose bandanas because at the time that we were kind of designing this show, you got to remember, to the beginning of the pandemic, there weren't enough masks for everybody.
Oh, yeah.
And so bandanas became something that people were wearing, you know, at large. And then couple that with the civil and social demand for equity in our country at the time. Protection against the microbe, and then also protection against chemicals, you know, tear gas, all of the social unrest that was happening in the country. Protection against identity and protecting your identity. The bandana became an object that, if we were going to do a social collaboration, we had to think about what it meant. We couldn't get people to go out and buy materials because that wasn't an option at the time. So the question was, what do you think most of us have access to right now in this instant, you know? And so the bandana, or a cut piece of fabric within that same shape, became the kind of like analog to express, how are you doing right now? You know, what has been your experience? Please share that with us. What safety, what comfort, whatever it is you're doing presently to take care of yourself, share that on a bandana, embroider that onto a bandana. Use whatever materials you have access to. If you don't have embroidery thread, use dental floss, use yarn, use whatever you can, and stitch onto me how you're feeling, you know? And that became the hide and shelter for this she-wolf. And she's presented in a way that she's lying down and her belly is exposed. She's in the process of feeding, because we were like, what is the first sense of security, of shelter, or of safety that any of us has experienced as like mammals, you know? And we were like, at your mother's breast. Like, it doesn't have to be a home. It doesn't have to be a building. Comfort and security and shelter happens there first for almost all of us mammals, you know? And so we wanted to invite the audience to understand shelter and comfort and security under that level. And then ask our community to build the shelter for the wolf who is building the shelter or creating the shelter for you. So it's this reciprocation of kinship and relationship, where her hide, the thing that protects her, was created by us, you know, and our creation opened up the opportunity for the audience to enter into that space and be sheltered in that same way. So there's a reciprocation of dynamic there.
I can safely say firsthand experience. I mean, I remember reading that seeing the piece in person, that her belly was exposed for that reason. But much like you, like, can't digest all of these things and retain so much information. The feeling of being comforted by the she-wolf in person, that has stuck with me. Just meeting you today, I'm thinking of bandanas and my own pink bandana as a baby, and it still just brings me great comfort. So it was very successful in that way.
Yeah, thank you. And that's once again, that was responding to limitation. You know, we were like, okay, Marie has a history of doing social engagement work where she invites people in and builds like these sewing circles and opportunities for people to meet at the museum or at other places where they can all gather. But my social collaboration background is in creating videos and opportunities for people to participate from afar. So it's not necessarily that we need to gather. And so we kind of like re-angled our initial social engagement to kind of be in the position of how I had done it before. So we made a video on what we wanted, and we tried to use no language in it so that it would be open to anybody, you know, just use a visual language to present what we're creating. And yeah, the response was amazing. And I think that that once again was, we couldn't have done it without help. We couldn't have done it without support. There's no way I would have embroidered that many bandanas, like alone. It's
Right.
possible, but that's a completely different conversation. That puts me in a position of power that isn't necessarily what we want to talk about or celebrate. And the title of the exhibition is Each Other. So it's a celebration of us in the museum. It's a celebration of us creating culture, not going to a place to decide what culture is, but be an active participant in its maintenance.
That brings to mind a few conversations we've had throughout this programming series in the past about the weight of being a culture bearer. And that's a whole hour-long plus conversation in itself, but you are a culture bearer.
Yeah, and I would also slough the weight of that onto all of us. I cannot be a culture bearer alone in my studio without an audience. I can make all the same stuff, but it doesn't have the same impact without it being understood, filtered, and regurgitated, back into public at large. And I strongly believe, we put a lot of focus on the arts and the humanities and craft as a source for culture, but I would say that there's a much larger conversation around what we do as human beings, as people, as living things in a much larger network. How do we celebrate and recognize that because you are alive today, because you are a culture bearer. You are participating in generating what it means and what we deem important for future generations. You might not be making anything. You might be doing a job that's at a base level, barely getting by, covering rent and providing food and shelter for your children. That's plenty. That is the generation of culture. Everything else outside of that is decorating it and transcribing those basic necessities into a way that a much larger kind of community could understand. I think that's the role of arts and humanities and stuff in society, is to transcribe our lived experience into a way that celebrates the intersections of our living.
Something you said earlier to me was, and I'm just sort of guessing here that, we talk about change in creating each other, adapting to the immediate pandemic and opting for bandanas. You talked to me about how you love this format because you get to it's done and you're with your family immediately afterwards. And so I am turning this into a question about, change and how the pandemic has given us certain things forced us to change in these beautiful ways. And I think that's the case with you, right?
Yeah, beautiful ways, complicated ways. I think one of the silver linings, in the wake of so much loss, so much mental health issues that we're not even talking about yet. There's going to be fallout from this for a while. As we try to understand how to deal with what we've experienced in the immediate. A little bit of breath would be nice, but it keeps coming back up. So we haven't had a chance to really breathe about it. But one of the silver linings that I saw pretty quickly was this is how we always do it was no longer a valid response.
1,000%.
Yeah. And I was like, thank goodness. We had to adapt dramatically quickly, and we've made mistakes in that adaptation, but taking out this is how we always do it narrative from that equation, it produced so many variables that are site specific to the response, and I think that there's something profound in that also we haven't completely comprehended. Our capacity to reach our immediate needs in any way that we could. Like there were things that unfolded that I think were profoundly beautiful and profoundly complicated. And that complexity is something that's missing from our larger kind of social structure narratives. We are happy to reduce things to their simplest form and decide that's how we do it, that's how we'll always do it. But complexity actually produces much more elaborate and beautiful responses to change, you know? And yeah, I don't know, like that's something that I had been thinking about quite a bit.
Can you give us an example within that scope of change that you noticed in your work? You know, is there some immediate shift that you made?
I will tell you, and this is just immediate, that you need no fact checker for this. I was there. I am your fact checker. Prior to the pandemic, I was slowly, but consistently being eroded from my own life. Like the amount of travel that I had to do, the demand of going and being at places to present work, to do talks, do all of this sort of stuff. In my mind, I'm like, I'm doing this so that I can provide a way for my 2 boys and my wife. You know, I'm like, I am entangled in this economic structure, and I am going out there being the breadwinner, bringing home the bacon. I'm trying to provide for my family a safe and comfortable place. And in the process of doing so, I removed myself from my family, you know? So I'm like, what was I building? You know, I'm like, I've been away so much that I lost I missed things. My kids are 10 and 8 now. So they were young prior to the pandemic, but even before then, as I was traveling around, the general demand, you know, them learning to speak, I missed some of that. You know what I'm saying? Them really getting a grasp on how to walk around in the world or how to be a human being, I missed some of that, you know, and justified it by doing what is expected of me, you know, in the way that this is how it's always done. But it was a lie. It was a complete lie. And in the process, I removed myself from my family slowly but surely, you know, eroding what our family meant because I wasn't present, because I wasn't there, you know. And anytime I was scrambling to produce work, thinking about the next place that I had to go. So even when I was home, I was gone, you know. This pandemic forced us to reconsider what community is and who is most important to us. It forced us to be around our families in ways that our much larger systems kind of like was in the process of removing, you know, for generations now. You know, it was like, that's not as important. Do this. This is the model. This is how the machine works. You need to keep it greased. Make sure you're going out there and doing stuff. But I think a lot of us had the opportunity to, one, be in that uncomfortableness of being in, you know, in close proximity to our immediate family and our immediate community. You know, that really transformed like a lot of social structures and, you know, just within the immediate family group, but then all of these rings of what community means outside of that, you know? So I don't know, there's been something kind of profound that unfolded in all of that. And I would say that was the immediate first instance for me to experience where I was like, I'm sorry it cost this much for me to learn that. Let me celebrate the value of that cost, you know, from now on.
Right, and that turned into, is that what turned into this this sort of side, you know, directive mission that you're on to fight for family residencies as artist residencies? And I know I botched that, but how would you explain it?
How I would express that is I was seeing the importance of that prior to the pandemic, but there was no fire in that. You know what I'm saying? Like,
so to be clear for our guests, Cannupa was mentioning that he's been talking about it he came to Boston to speak about it, about institutions creating residencies for artists that include their family structure, their immediate family, and the importance of that. Yeah.
My first time coming to Boston in any sort of real way was around that sort of conversation. And coincidentally, the group that I came out to talk with, now that I'm thinking about it, it might not have been Boston. Now that I'm thinking about it, but it was within region. I don't want to start creating regional things, but now that I'm remembering, I'm like, oh no, that wasn't Boston at all. It was close.
That's
but I'm
okay.
not going to say where it was. But anyway, there were folks from Boston there for sure, because there are these residencies and there's a much larger network, especially within the craft world, of the opportunity to go and do an artist residency at some place. It celebrated the artist as an individual, so it was like, here, let me carve out 2 weeks, 2 months, of however long, to come out and for you to really focus on, here's a facility, focus and create, something. But I think that thinking is backwards, because it first has to assume that your craft, your skill, your art is separate from your life somehow, that there was a compartmentalization there. And I just don't think that there is, not in any of our lives. Like how much has design influenced our day-to-day living? It's totally entangled, it's only embedded. But then moreover, if you want to get the best out of me as an artist or as a craftsperson or a creator, it's not a matter of taking me away from my life and allowing me focus. It's supporting my life to create something in that space, and so I had been lobbying, especially as I'm 42 now. At the time when I was doing that, I think I was like my late 30s, but I just kept seeing all of these residency programs that were developed by people who had families, and they were inhabiting those spaces that these residencies were taking place. But there was like a focus on like young artists coming out and having the opportunity to do this sort of thing. But the reality is that young artists were having kids, and family was a part of all of that. And so I was like, I kept kind of thinking about, once again, looking at community and what a community means and how we define that, oftentimes working with larger structures, institutions, museums, foundations, all of this sort of stuff. Community is like code word for brown and black people within the region's space. It's oftentimes coded. But when we really define community, we have to really consider what a family is. Your immediate, the nexus of your community is your relationship to your immediate family. And then outside of that, there are rings of connection. But if we don't begin to support that initial ring, that core idea of what a community means, if we don't figure out a way within our social structures to support that, then any effort we make on those peripheral rings will not survive, because we're not supporting the interior of it. And inside of that, the only thing you'll generate is rot, and you can't grow from that, So that was kind of like my impulse, especially like, residencies, programs, schools, all of this sort of stuff, they're beholden to funding. But how do you build the language to support them to ask for what we need rather than ask for what we think somebody else needs, And, that family dynamic is a really great intersectional space, because by and large, most of us, regardless of our cultural background, historical or economic background, we understand what that means first, And that's a great way to actually, it's like, if I can treat my neighbor the way I treat my mother, what would our world look like? How do you treat your neighbor the same way that you treat your immediate family, and consider what community means in that model? It'd be transformative,
Yeah. For our guests, if you have any questions, just hand them to us. I saw someone raise a hand, so if you have a question, just type it into the either the chat window or the Q&A window. You're
Well,
going to show, oh, go ahead. What?
yeah, no, I was going to say, once again, this is all jaw work, right? Like, this is theory. Let me see practice. Let's see what practice looks like.
I have a question for you though, before we dive into your work, very briefly.
Yeah.
We at North Bennett Street School, we speak about the hand, head, and heart connection. You know, we're using our hands, the connectivity between the three. In your practice, and this is a two-pronged question, you consider yourself as a craftsperson and an artist. They can go hand in hand or they can be separate. Which one of those do you most identify with? And which leads you in your life, your hands or your head or your heart?
Yeah. I think my hands lead me to a fault oftentimes.
I know that feeling. Yeah.
Yeah. I run into this conversation with my wife all the time. I'm like, dude, labor is my love language. Like, let me make you something. Let me build you something. Let me try to solve our problem. Even that, I'm like, let me try to solve it. You know, she's like, I don't want you to solve the problem. I want you to fucking listen to me. You know, I want you to feel what I'm feeling. And I'm like, yeah, but let me build a machine.
I'll build it. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So I would say that a lot of my practice is material based. I'm interested in material. I'm interested in how, in the process of creating something, the material you use, as much as you push it and shape it and change it, it's doing the same thing to you. You know, there's a reciprocation of construction in that. And if you're in the right heart, mind place, you'll generally, that's what gets kind of like cultivated in the process, you know. But
and so are there different times where you identify what, you know, you use that identifier of craftsperson, and then other times when you're, you know, I don't, and I throw that out as maybe not answerable, but
yeah, it's vaguely answerable. I think it depends on where you're asking me. You know, you're in my studio right now. I'm a craftsperson in here. I love making things. That's the reality of my mental space, is that to build something with my hands, to create something out of what's left over, you know, what I can find in the world, that is probably the closest thing that I have to a mental health practice. It is my medicine, you know, and I'm oftentimes I'm sick, you know, I'm not in a good place, and this is what I take to help me. And it's it's habit.
I love that. We're in mental health month too.
It's not addictive. You know what I'm saying?
Yes,
like,
exactly.
It's totally habit forming, and a good habit is something that I'm definitely in need of. You know. I love a good habit. You know.
We just talked to these survivors of gun violence that are blowing glass with Project Fire in Chicago, and that's what we were talking about. Is this capability of taking darkness and using your hands to weave it somehow and then put it back out in this beautiful way, and that's what you're speaking about.
The world gives you things that are not yours, you know, and you'll carry them, and you'll if you carry them long enough, they become your identity, you know. And I'm constantly reminding myself, like, dude, that's not yours, put it down, you know, that's not yours, put it down. And the creation of work is an excellent conduit to release that burden, you know, where I'm like, all right, now let me transcribe this conversation so that all of us can shoulder the weight of this thing, rather than me in my, you know, closed space. Like, this is our stuff. It's not mine. You know, that's not mine. Put it down. You know, this is our stuff. So it's
perfect.
like, yeah, how do we burden that and shift that responsibility, you know? And there are a lot of things in our society that become a part of our identity, but these were impositions, you know, whether they're economic, social, cultural, you know, these are impositions, and it's not yours. Like, you don't have to carry that, put it down, you know?
I have a question while you're going to lead us to some of your material that you're working with.
Yeah.
A question from a guest: what is the role of hope and dreaming in your work, and how do you make space for it in your process?
Yeah. Once again, this is a hand thing, and this is why I say hand drives me. I have a hard time with hope as a word. I try not even to say it. I don't even say like, I hope you're doing well.
What do you say?
I imagine you're well. I imagine you're well. I don't say I hope you're doing well.
So you assume that they're well, and that's a safer bet.
Yeah, I'm gonna assume that you're well. If I'm wrong, you'll tell me. And if it's my position, if I can help in any sort of way, you'll tell me. I found that hope is a closed circuit. You can hope for things to happen, and that completes it. You're like, all right, I'm hoping, and I'm hoping. I like to actively move towards things. So even like dream and imagine, these are like safer words, but it's closer to the nebulousness that hope holds. Like to dream or to imagine something, it holds the same nebulous space that hope holds in my mind. I like to actively move towards what it is that I want to see as change. And that once again might be a hand, response between the three to kind of navigate. And I'm not displacing or discrediting the position of hope within the human psyche. For me personally, I like to work towards what it is that I could imagine, what it is that I could dream, and what it is that I could hope, rather than sit in the position of dreaming, imagining, or hoping. So I'm like, I want to be an active participant in that change.
Right, and that makes total sense. And in that context, what do you do with obstacles that come your way?
I eat them. I eat them.
No, I mean, if you don't use those ideas of, if you feel like it's a closed circuit, like, and you work towards just making your way towards what you want to have.
Yeah. Here's what I recognize as a living thing on the planet Earth. The world that I can build in my mind, the place that I can hope for in my heart, and the dreams that I can construct with my hands. I will not be a part of it. I will not. I will die trying. I'm in this for the long game. I don't want no short return on this. I want a generation of children I will never meet to live in the world that I can imagine presently, rather than like throw a stone in the river to try to cross it and change the river forever. Oftentimes our intrepid efforts to repair things or to make easier our efforts end up causing trauma and problems for future generations that we don't ever acknowledge, recognize, or build any sort of structure for them to kind of like transition out of. Every dam on every river in the country is a perfect example of that model. We saw a problem, we intrepidly built something to solve that problem. In the process, we've crippled a system that had been working for millions of years. With the short-sighted effort of our individual growth and our immediate growth. That's going to be a conversation down the road that I'm not going to be there for. Right. So yeah, I see obstacles, I slam into it, I eat it, like I was saying.
How do you impart this long view onto your next generation, your boys? I mean, what is an example of something that you teach them to see their existence beyond this lifespan of theirs?
Yeah, we do have a strange and comfortable relationship with the fact that we are doomed. Like I was
sons
like,
do?
yeah. I'm like, well, because the conversation comes up. They're 8 and 10 now, and they slowly begin to recognize that I'm not going to be there forever, that I will die, that there is a relationship to that. And rather than leaning into the haunting of death, I'm like, dude, this is why apples are delicious. You know, I can only have so many, you know, this is life. Like, you know what the greatest gift of life is? The cost. Like, the cost of living is so high that nobody makes it out alive. You know, nobody does.
Well,
Nothing
also,
does.
I'm just refreshed to hear you speak this candidly about it, because we have an unhealthy relationship with death in this country. And
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I think that this country was built on a myth, and it was something that we talked about earlier, but it's this myth of rugged individualism. You know, there is a myth that this country has pushed forward that we teach to our children at the most susceptible age. We tell stories of like Johnny Appleseed, you know, we tell stories of rugged individuals who intrepidly made their way across the country and lifted themselves against all metaphysical and physical possibilities by their own bootstraps, levitating, you know, in space to strive for something without recognizing that nobody has ever done anything alone, ever. Like, ever. So the celebration of us as a collection is something that, you know, my boys have the benefit of learning from. I had the benefit of learning from, which is I grew up with a different sense of time in the world.
Explain that. What does that mean?
Well, so one of the ways that it's described in a lot of different ways, but through Indigenous models of I don't know, whatever we want to call it, whether it's cosmology or theology or something along those lines. There's a conversation around 7 generations, and there's different variations on it. How I was raised in that relationship to 7 generations, you are in the center of that. So you're navigating through time within the scope of 7 generations, which means you have your parents. The only reason you're here, you have to be accountable to your parents' parents, and a generation that you have never met, who have been dead already. You have to be accountable to 3 generations into the past, your ancestors, right? Because the only reason you're here is because what they did to put you into this position. Now, it's not enough that they did all of that for you to be here. The more significant aspect, and this is where the dreaming and the hoping and why I have a hard time responding to all of that, is because now that you're here and you made it this far and you're in the world and you're alive, you're not responsible to just yourself, but you have to acknowledge the fact that you are only borrowing this place presently from your children, your children's children, and children you will never meet. You will never meet them. So you're only borrowing this place, this time, this land, this environment from them. Act accordingly. Act accordingly, you know? That is a different way to navigate through space and time, you know? And I had the benefit of knowing that. And in that knowledge, you see everything else and you see everybody else in the world hungry for their time now, you know, like, this is it, YOLO, all of that stuff. And I'm just like, no, like, it's not true. Like, sure, you're going to die, but you have a wake, you know, it ripples in every direction, not just around you immediately, but forward and backwards in time.
That's so important. You have a wake, you know, recognizing that you create waves in, like, you know, where you came from, where you're going to. That's a beautiful thought. And
they'll hit some of those obstacles and they'll come back to you. And then you're like, I'm different now. I made a mistake then. I've learned from it. You know, there's opportunity. This isn't a way, you know, or this isn't the way. This is a way. You know, this is something to consider as you navigate through space. And the thing is that it's in process. It's in flux. It's constantly changing. There are new things that we never would have expected that we are going to see. We are going to face. How do we adapt to those sorts of changes has a lot to do with how committed were we to what it is right now, you know?
We need to see some of your work.
All right, cool.
I mean, we don't need to see your work. We would like to see your work.
Yeah, I took off my hat because a lot of the work that I'm working on right now, it uses my head as a conduit. So I'm working on a project that's looking at our more than human kinships with buffalo, not just as native people, but as this country at large. There was an annihilation of buffalo between 1840s to 1895, 45, 50 years. 60 million reduced to 1,500 within 40 years. Devastating. We are still facing some of the outcomes of that presently that we haven't completely comprehended, but the bones of that material was transformed into bone black, which was a pigment, which I'm sure we're all familiar with as craft people, as makers, and calcium bicarbonate. And that went into fertilizer primarily, but there was so much of it from this loss that it actually went into steel production as well. So this country's kind of like growth into the global world through the industrialization had some benefits from buffalo. So I have been working with some strange materials that I get access to, which is one, industrialized felt that I get as, it comes like
Is that
this.
the same felt that we've seen in a lot of your work? Yes. Yep.
So this is a free material that I get from a place in Albuquerque called Submaterial, and they make soundproofing walls, creative responses to the terrible architecture of the 90s.
Yes, yes.
So they get rems and it's all like this, just these thin strips. So I'm like, all right, what can I make with that? And
where would those otherwise end up, Cannupa?
They've given them to like every craft school, every public school in the Albuquerque region. Otherwise, they have a truck that comes in maybe like 3 times a year, and that's turned into fiber for like wadding and filling and stuff like that.
So it is repurposed. They find a way to repurpose it. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. But their production is so massive that they have lots of it.
Right.
So they're happy to like support creative responses to it. Here's one of my creative responses. So this is all those same strips, and it's also built out of, this is foam from the guy who builds my crates for my work as it travels. He also has a large selection of waste scraps and rems, and I built this whole infrastructure for this piece.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. It's beautiful.
So there's 5 of these being built right now in my studio. Another material that I like to repurpose is Afghans. So
is this part of the same project? Is that a buffalo? Is this part of the buffalo?
Yeah, this is part of the same project, same building materials to get the form, surfaced differently. This is the felt, but all of this is an Afghan. I like using these materials because they are, the cost of creation is much higher than the value of them in our space. And I love that primarily these are made with care, the original market for this is a gift economy, and I love that. They're usually gifts. I find them at thrift stores and they're like between $4 and $10, and I'm like, I would not make you that for $10. I would, and I love that it is usually gifted to the place that I end up finding it. The thrift store is probably a donation from somebody who could no longer house it, but.
Wow. It's beautiful.
It's also, I've been making these using that material because I could use leather. I could use some of our customary materials that we would make some of our original regalia out of. but I'm so far removed from the production of that leather that it becomes the industry that supports it is toxic. You know, it's like, it's gnarly. I'm like, I don't know if you killed that in the right way before you processed it, you know? These Afghans are closer to the care that we would do in the creation of a hide, you know, in the preparation of a hide, in the celebration of an animal. It's closer to the same kind of language that I like to share in the creation of some of these regalias, is that I like craft people, I like art people, because in our society presently, they are some of the, they're people who I know are putting more into our world than they're taking out, you know, not all of them. Most of the ones that I know are putting more in than they're taking out, you know? And I think that's a great model, especially once we start talking about this like 7 generations kind of narrative. It's like, this is the reason why we used every part of an animal that we harvested or killed or plant or any other kinship, you know, more than human kinships that we have. You recognize its loss and its removal from things that are alive in the world. How do you put more in than you've taken out? And you've taken out a life. So what are you going to do to put more into that? And a lot of our art that was, you know, quote unquote art of Native people is really just a collection of celebrating the effort of putting more in to what we've taken out of the world, you know? So you use all the material, you use the bone, you use the sinew, you use the hide, you tan the hide, and then you decorate it. And you decorate it usually as a gift for somebody else. Like you're making this for somebody. So its life lives on beyond what was lost. You consume it, you eat it, and you feed many people. You take one life and you feed many, you know? So there are things that are embedded, and I'm using new materials, but I'm expressing a very old practice, you know? And so do we call it art? Do we call it craft? I'm like, no, you all do. And I'm happy to stand in that place, you know, but this is living in a beautiful way, you know?
Are these going to be used in a multimedia the way in performance?
Yeah, I tend to take these and do performances on the land and use the, you know, invite the land, invite myself into the land, and invite the conversation of the landscape as a contributor to the work. So they're flashy, they're punchy, they pop out on whatever landscape I'm engaging with. But in this instance, I'm going to try out something new. So that'll unfold as it unfolds. I don't like saying anything that I haven't done yet.
Of course. A few of our guests just want to spread this to you. Thank you for centering the notion of 7 generations. Really appreciate that. That's so valuable and important. Love the analogy of taking caretaking in art making. The Afghan is more closely related to the care that was once taken in making a hide. And anyone else have any questions for Cannupa, let us know right now, because we're at the top of the hour. And I just want to tell you a personal story because of your this buffalo, which you've just told me about. I was not aware of this. As a young, tiny person, my family's from Oklahoma, and they actually, way back, they're from Peoria. They're Peorian Indians. And I don't have enough information on that, but I from this point forward, I will. But as a small child, I went to Oklahoma and saw buffalo. And, you know, when you're that tiny, these buffalo are massive. And I can still feel it and smell it to this day. And I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to see an Oklahoma buffalo.
Yeah, totally. They're on the rise. I didn't want to focus on their loss. I wanted to focus on their growth. There's like 500,000 buffalo in continental US right now. So there's 20,000 of those 500,000 that are living wild, you know, which is really beautiful. So I'm just I want to celebrate their growth rather than their loss.
I can't wait to see what you do with that. And I'm going to end us here. Thank you for our guests for being with us this afternoon. I really appreciate it. This has been a wonderful season of In the Making. And Cannupa, you're just the best season finale guest. I have really, really valued this time with you.
Thank you. And you're welcome. You're all welcome.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night. And thank you, Cannupa, again. Take care.
So long.
Bye.